Alright, welcome back to another lesson in research methods. Today we are going to look particularly at study designs. Now, if you're going to conduct research, you're going to have to document your processes, you're going to document what you're going to do in what we call a research blueprint, or better still, research study design. So your research plan is going to follow a particular blueprint depending on your research objectives and your research questions. And these are what we call the study designs. So I'm going to talk specifically about quantitative observational study designs. Now these are study designs that a researcher undertakes if they want to go and observe a phenomena, observe a situation happening and document and be able to explain what is happening without intervening. We have two broad types of these observational study designs. One, we have what we call the descriptive study designs. These are the designs where the results that come from such a study are really describing what transpired, describing the relationship between one entity and another, okay? But are not making any inferences as far as causation is concerned, as X causing Y. The second type is the analytic study. These analytic studies then go a step further than the descriptive studies, and then they give us information regarding cause and effect. Okay, so that is the difference between the descriptive and the analytic studies. So let's first dive into the descriptive study designs. We have three main categories of descriptive study designs. The first category are what we call the case reports. The second are the case series, and then the third are the cross-sectional study designs. So I'm going to talk about the case report and the case series in the same thing because they are one and the same. Now, the case report is typically a study design that is conducted when a researcher encounters a new phenomena, encounters a new disease, and is interested in documenting every single detail about this disease. Okay? For example, in COVID, when we had COVID, where so many case reports were published by different people who were experiencing COVID for the first time and wanted to document what they were experiencing. Now, when all these cases are put together, when now the cases start piling up, okay, you compile them and you do some statistics, you give us some means. Now what you have is a case series, okay? When we go a little further, we are going to meet the cross-sectional study. Now this cross-sectional study is also similar to the case series in that it's a collection of cases, although these cases are randomly obtained from a bigger population. Okay, so what happens here is you go into a population and you freeze that population in time. So for example, you come to Kampala on a particular day, 3rd of August. Then you go and you test all the people in Kampala, test them for malaria and find out how many people have malaria. Then you report that on the 3rd of August, 30 people had malaria. So that is like a cross-section or a snapshot on that particular day of the occurrence of malaria. Now that's what we call a cross-sectional study. Now the difference between a cross-sectional study and a case series is that the cross-sectional studies denominator includes both people who have disease and people who don't have disease, okay? While the case series only has people who have disease. And typically the statistics that are reported in case series are things like case fatality rates, how many people are dying, cause-specific death, remission rates and the like, but you will not be able to report a prevalence in a case series. Now, those are the descriptive study designs. So collectively, what are the advantages of these descriptive study designs? Obviously, they are cheap to conduct because they typically deal with smaller samples, okay? Also, they provide very new information because you are able to go in detail on a specific case as opposed to having to deal with so many people. So they provide a lot of good new information that is the basis for further research. Now, the disadvantage of these descriptive study designs is that we cannot be able to establish causality. Obviously, because we do not have the component of time. We are not able to distance, of course, the exposure from the outcome. Everything is happening at the same time, so we cannot be able to infer causality. So those are the main disadvantages of descriptive study designs. Alright, now let's look at the other broad category of observational study designs. And now we're going to look at the analytic study designs. And we say these study designs are analytic because they establish cause and effect relationships. And most of these analytic studies also have what we call control groups. Now let's look at the first example of the analytic study design, and this is the cohort study. Now the word cohort means a group of individuals who have similar attributes and tend to move in the same time frame, or are followed up for the same time frame. So for example, if you went to school in 2001 in a particular school, you are considered cohort 2001. So if you have a WhatsApp group and everything, and you followed up people over time and you know what they're up to, that is the cohort 2001 that you have in that group. So that is what a cohort really is. Now in research, we get people with similar characteristics, but maybe differing on one special characteristic, which we shall call the exposure. So for example, we get people who all come from a particular village, and some go and work in the mine and others don't. And then we follow these people up over time to see those who develop respiratory diseases, okay, such as COPD. Now this is what we call a prospective cohort study, where we follow up people over time, okay, and we find out whether they get the disease. So we start today, then we examine the people later after several years or weeks or months, and then find out whether they have the disease. So we start with only those who are exposed and those who are not exposed. And then we have, of course, the retrospective cohort, where we now move back in time. Then we get records, let's say 5 years ago, of people who are exposed to a condition and people who are not exposed to a condition. Then we come back today and find out those who got the disease and those who did not get the disease. Okay, so it's still a follow-up, but done more using records, going back in time and coming to the current state. The cohort study is advantageous because the cohort study is going to establish cause and effect. You're going to be able to say X caused Y because you're going to start with the exposure, then you get the outcome later. Cohort studies are typically also good when you are dealing with rare exposures. For example, the bombing that happened in Japan. Those people who got exposed to the radiation were followed up over time, and we were able to understand the effects of those atomic bombs on the population health without having so many people followed up, just a few of the survivors who were followed up. The main disadvantage with cohort studies is that it is expensive to conduct because you have to follow up both the cases and the controls. The other disadvantage, of course, is the high attrition, high loss to follow-up rate. People are going to drop off the study, especially if the study duration is quite long, if you're following up people for 10, 12, 15 years. Now let's look at case controls. In a case control, typically you have most times a scarce, a rare disease, and so you gather all the people who have the disease from so many places and put them together, and so you get your 20, 30 people who say have breast cancer. Then you look for people who don't have breast cancer but are similar in, the demographic distribution, and then you bring those people together, interview them, go back in time and find out whether they were exposed to a specific exposure of interest, let's say use of family planning, use of hormonal therapy, and then you're able to get the prevalence of exposure in those who have the disease and those who don't have the disease. Okay, so now the difference between the case control and the cohort is that the case control starts with those who have disease and moves back to find the prevalence of exposure, while the cohort study starts with those who are exposed, then moves ahead to find those who have the disease. Thank you again for watching. See you in the next lesson.